The year was 1968, and the Cold War was deep in its most silent and unforgiving phase. Somewhere in the vast emptiness of the North Pacific, the Soviet ballistic missile submarine K-129 disappeared without a trace. It was March, a month of storms and shifting currents, and Moscow lost contact with the vessel during what was supposed to be a routine patrol. For the men aboard, it had been another mission beneath the endless gray sea, standard drills, encrypted orders, silence. But then the silence deepened into something permanent. No distress calls, no emergency beacons, no survivors. To the Soviet Navy, it was a catastrophe. To the United States, it was an opportunity unlike any in history. Because K-129 wasn't just any submarine. It was armed with 3 nuclear-tipped missiles, a library of classified codes, and the kind of intelligence treasure that could alter global power overnight. The ocean swallowed it at more than 16,000 feet, 3 miles below the surface, where pressure crushed steel like paper and light itself disappeared. For weeks, Soviet ships scoured the sea, desperate to find the wreck, deploying hundreds of vessels, aircraft, and sonar sweeps across thousands of square miles. They found nothing. The Pacific was too vast and their technology too limited. Eventually, the search was called off, the loss blamed on mechanical failure, and families were told their sons had died serving the motherland. But someone else was still listening. The United States Navy's secret underwater surveillance system, SOSUS, had detected something extraordinary. A deep, low-frequency acoustic signature consistent with a massive implosion somewhere northwest of Hawaii. Analysts at the Navy Sound Surveillance Center triangulated the source, and their calculations led to one conclusion. The Soviets had lost a nuclear submarine. For the Pentagon and the CIA, that meant one thing. If the wreck could be located and recovered, even partially, it would reveal Soviet missile technology, cryptographic systems, and naval procedures that the U.S. had spent decades trying to understand. The plan that began in those classified briefings would become one of the most ambitious and expensive covert operations in history, Operation Azorian. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was a billion-dollar gamble at the bottom of the Pacific. The task seemed impossible. No one had ever attempted a deep-sea recovery at 16,000 feet. The pressure there exceeded 7,000 pounds per square inch, strong enough to crush titanium hulls. But the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology saw it as a challenge worthy of the Cold War's absurd ambition. Within months, reconnaissance aircraft, spy satellites, and deep-sea survey vessels were mapping the ocean floor. It took them nearly 2 years to pinpoint the wreck. In 1974, the CIA finally confirmed K-129's resting place, a twisted skeleton of metal scattered across the seabed, its hull ruptured, its secrets sealed in darkness. What they found changed everything. The forward section appeared intact. If they could raise that portion, it would contain missile launch systems, cryptographic machines, and perhaps even log books and code books that could expose Soviet command structure. But the operation couldn't be public. If Moscow discovered that the United States was salvaging one of its nuclear submarines, it would see it as an act of aggression, possibly enough to trigger war. So the CIA needed a cover story, something large enough to explain the presence of a massive recovery ship in the middle of the Pacific. They found their answer in an eccentric billionaire, Howard Hughes. The plan was simple on paper but insane in practice. The CIA would commission a colossal ship under Hughes's name, claiming it was designed for deep-sea mining. The world would believe that Hughes, the reclusive American magnate known for wild projects and private obsessions, was building a vessel to harvest manganese nodules from the ocean floor. In reality, the ship, christened the Glomar Explorer, was a spy machine disguised as a scientific marvel. It would descend into the abyss, grab a Soviet submarine with mechanical claws, and lift it to the surface without anyone noticing. Every engineer, every scientist, every sailor involved had to sign secrecy oaths that would last decades. Even the fabrication companies assembling the parts didn't know the full purpose of what they were building. The Glomar Explorer's claw, codenamed Clementine, was a monstrous steel contraption the size of a building. It had to operate 3 miles underwater, maneuver with surgical precision, and hoist thousands of tons of wreckage through freezing blackness. On error, one fracture in the lifting cables, and the entire mission would be lost. As the ship neared completion, tensions in Washington rose. The cost was staggering, over $300 million, equivalent to nearly $2 billion today. Skeptics inside the intelligence community warned that the engineering risks were too high, that the Soviets might detect the operation, that the secrecy couldn't hold. But to the men in charge, the potential rewards justified everything. In the Cold War, information was worth more than gold. As the Glomar Explorer prepared for launch in the summer of 1974, the CIA's director, William Colby, called it a one-shot miracle. Either they would succeed and rewrite the rules of espionage, or fail in silence at the bottom of the ocean. By the summer of 1974, the Glomar Explorer stood gleaming in Long Beach Harbor, California, towering above the water like an alien construct. Its hull shimmered under the Pacific sun, and the newspapers hailed it as Howard Hughes' newest experiment, an audacious ship designed to mine the ocean floor for rare metals. Reporters marveled at its scale, calling it the future of industrial innovation. Only a handful of people on Earth knew the truth. The ship wasn't built to mine, it was built to steal. Beneath its decks hid the most secret machine of the Cold War, the massive mechanical claw that would descend 3 miles down to grab a Soviet nuclear submarine and raise it from the abyss. Every inch of the vessel was engineered for deception. Publicly, Hughes' company managed press releases, promotional tours, and press kits showing colorful diagrams of manganese nodules and deep-sea harvesters. Privately, the CIA's Special Projects Division oversaw the final tests of the capture vehicle, which technicians called Clementine. Inside the ship's central bay, called the Moon Pool, was a rectangular opening through which Clementine would be lowered into the ocean. Hydraulic arms the size of buildings surrounded it. The design looked like something out of science fiction, but it had to work in total secrecy. Crews were told only what they needed to know. Welders thought they were constructing a mining rig. Engineers believed they were building recovery equipment for ocean research. Only the core CIA and Hughes personnel understood the operation's real goal: raise the Soviet K-129 from a depth no human had ever reached. The challenge wasn't just technical, it was political. The Pacific wasn't empty. Soviet trawlers and surveillance ships routinely patrolled the waters, and the Americans had to operate in plain sight without raising suspicion. To cover their presence, the CIA filed public navigation plans showing mining operations in the Central Pacific, complete with fabricated scientific coordinates. To the outside world, the Glomar Explorer was a marvel of capitalism. To Moscow, it was background noise. On June 20th, 1974, the ship set sail under the command of Captain Jim Bradley, an experienced mariner handpicked for his steadiness under pressure. He and his crew, more than 170 men, were sworn to silence under penalty of imprisonment. Once at sea, the ship's demeanor changed. Civilian chatter stopped, and the hull throbbed with the vibration of classified machinery. Every message to the mainland was encrypted. On the deck, men in civilian clothes carried notebooks marked only with code numbers. Below them, deep in the hull, technicians monitored hydraulic pressures, power feeds, and sensor arrays that would guide Clementine into the depths. The target zone lay in a remote expanse of the Pacific, roughly 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, an area so vast and featureless it was nicknamed the Abyssal Plain. When the ship arrived, the crew deployed sonar buoys and mapping gear to verify the exact location of K-129. For 3 days, the equipment scanned the seabed until sonar screens flickered with confirmation. The wreck was there. The countdown to history had begun. Lowering Clementine took 6 hours. The machine, weighing more than 4,000 tons, moved inch by inch through the moon pool into the dark. Cameras mounted along the lowering pipe showed it vanishing into nothingness. At 16,000 feet, light could not reach, and water pressure could crush steel into dust. Engineers watched their instruments like surgeons, every number meaning life or failure. The descent was so deep that the steel pipes connecting the claw to the ship stretched for 3 miles, a mechanical umbilical cord dangling into blackness. It swayed gently under ocean currents, each movement amplified by the sheer length of the line. One miscalculation, and it would snap like a thread. As Clementine reached the seabed, the first images of the K-129 appeared on monitor screens, ghostly gray shapes of a dead machine half buried in silt. The submarine's midsection had imploded, but the forward part looked remarkably intact. You could still see the missile tubes, the torn Soviet insignia, and the corroded steel plates. The men aboard the Glomar Explorer fell silent. For years they had worked in secret, and now they were staring at the prize that justified it all. The claw extended its arms, each the size of a tree trunk, and began the slow process of positioning itself beneath the wreck. It had to grip precisely or risk breaking the submarine apart. The tension inside the control room was suffocating. Above them, the Pacific stretched calm and indifferent, while 3 miles below, the CIA tried to commit the perfect theft. For 6 days, Clementine worked its way under the hull. Sensors mapped the structure while hydraulic locks sealed in place. When the system finally confirmed a secure grip, the ship's chief engineer whispered, "We've got her." Slowly, the hoisting began. Inch by inch, the claw started to lift the wreck from the seabed, dragging thousands of tons of Soviet metal through freezing black water. On the surface, massive winches strained, their gears shrieking from the pressure. Every bolt, every weld, every cable was being tested to its absolute limit. As the wreck ascended, the crew monitored vibrations along the pipe. The strain was unimaginable. Halfway up, disaster struck. The tension monitors spiked, and the entire ship lurched. Inside the control room, alarms screamed. Somewhere along the lifting line, a section of the claw failed. Engineers screamed for emergency release protocols, but it was too late. Through the cameras, they watched in horror as 2/3 of the K-129 slipped free and plunged back into the abyss, vanishing in a cloud of silt. The impact shook the ocean sensors. The ship's decks went quiet. The silence lasted a full minute before someone said what everyone was thinking. They had lost most of it. But the upper section, the portion still held by Clementine, remained secure. It contained missile tubes and, hopefully, the intelligence they came for. Against impossible odds, they continued. 3 days later, the crippled but victorious Glomar Explorer surfaced with a fragment of the Soviet submarine clutched in its steel jaws. What they had retrieved was smaller than planned, but inside lay secrets that no American had ever seen. Soviet nuclear warheads, decoding machines, and the remains of 6 crewmen who had gone down with the ship. The mission was incomplete, but it was a success that defied the laws of engineering and secrecy alike. And yet, for the CIA, the most dangerous part was still ahead, keeping the operation secret from a world about to start asking questions. When the Glomar Explorer finally secured the last section of the K-129's shattered hull and began its return journey to the surface, the men aboard knew they were witnessing something that might never be repeated. The Pacific swelled gently around them, hiding the most secret recovery mission in history beneath the calm illusion of ocean routine. In the ship's moon pool, as engineers disconnected the massive steel pipe that had reached 3 miles down, the tension was suffocating. No one spoke. Every clang of metal echoed like a heartbeat. When the final locks disengaged and Clementine's claw emerged dripping salt water and oil, it brought with it the twisted remains of a Soviet nuclear submarine, proof that the impossible had been done. Inside the forward section, teams in protective suits began their work immediately. The CIA's scientific crew had trained for years for this moment. They cut through corroded bulkheads, documenting everything with classified cameras. The smell was chemical and metallic, mixed with decay and oil. When they opened the main compartment, they found exactly what the analysts had hoped for: Soviet cryptographic materials. Books sealed in vacuum packs, message pads, even code tables. Some were too damaged to read, but others remained intact, perfectly preserved by the cold. One officer reportedly whispered, "This is Moscow's heartbeat." In another compartment lay a missile guidance gyroscope, evidence of how Soviet missiles were calibrated and controlled. It was data worth more than gold, an engineering map of Soviet nuclear capabilities. They found parts of 2 ballistic missile tubes, confirming that the K-129 had indeed been carrying armed R-21 missiles. Each discovery was photographed, cataloged, and sealed in containers marked only with serial codes. But then came the part no one was prepared for. As the team reached deeper into the wreck, they discovered human remains. At least 6 men, skeletal but recognizable, still in their uniforms. The ship fell silent as word spread. These were Soviet sailors, loyal men who had drowned in darkness thousands of miles from home. The crew, hardened by secrecy and science, now faced something that broke through their discipline. The CIA director, William Colby, later wrote in a classified memo that every effort was made to treat the remains with dignity. The bodies were photographed for identification and then placed in weighted caskets. On September 4th, 1974, the Glomar Explorer held a private ceremony at sea. The American crew gathered on the deck as an American flag was lowered to half-mast. A chaplain read a brief service, acknowledging the humanity of the fallen even as they served the other side. The casket slid gently into the ocean. As they vanished beneath the waves, the ship's engines rumbled, and a sense of eerie closure settled over the deck. No film crew, no journalist, no admiral would ever see that moment. But for the men who stood there, it was the day they buried the Cold War's ghosts. What they didn't know was that deep inside the CIA's Langley headquarters, analysts were already poring over the recovered data. The haul was smaller than hoped for, but still invaluable. Engineers confirmed that Soviet nuclear warheads were less advanced than American models, and the encryption systems used aboard K-129 revealed patterns in communication that the NSA could exploit for years. It was a limited victory, but one of staggering consequence. Still, the mission's success brought its own danger. The Soviets had already begun to suspect something. Months earlier, Soviet trawlers operating near the supposed mining zone had observed the massive Glomar Explorer lingering for weeks over one spot. At the time, the excuse of ocean research seemed plausible. But when Soviet naval intelligence noticed unusual American submarine traffic in the region, questions began to multiply. They launched quiet inquiries through diplomatic channels, pretending to be curious about Hughes's mining venture. The CIA deflected, insisting the ship was purely civilian. In Moscow, naval commanders weren't convinced. Satellite photos had shown American ships in the area months before. They didn't know what the Glomar Explorer had done, but they knew it wasn't mining. The KGB's Oceanic Division opened a new file under the codename Project K-129 Recovery. They couldn't prove the Americans had taken anything, but the suspicion never faded. By 1975, Soviet intelligence had issued secret memos warning that the U.S. might have compromised their naval codes. In a sense, they were right. The CIA, aware that Moscow's curiosity might grow, began tightening internal security. The operation was too big to stay hidden forever. As the Glomar Explorer returned to port, its crew was disbanded, its logs sealed, and its story erased. Even those who had risked their lives were told they could never speak about it. Many didn't even know the operation's real name. For the official record, the ship was just another of Howard Hughes's eccentric dreams. But in truth, it had pulled off one of the greatest intelligence heists in history. The CIA's problem now wasn't the Soviets, it was the press. Rumors had already begun circulating through defense contractors, and a handful of journalists were asking questions about a strange ship in a secret ocean project. If the story broke, the fallout could be catastrophic. The agency prepared its response, a phrase that would become legendary in intelligence culture. "We can neither confirm nor deny." Those 5 words would define the future of government secrecy and become known as the Glomar response. What began as a cover story for a deep-sea mission would become a template for silence itself, a doctrine of denial forged from the depths of the Pacific. Operation Azorian was over, but the shadows it cast would stretch across decades. The CIA had reached deeper into the ocean than anyone before, lifted a Soviet secret from the grave, and proven that even the laws of nature could bend before the machinery of Cold War ambition. Yet beneath the triumph was something darker, the realization that the Cold War had no limits, that there was no place on Earth, land, or sea beyond its reach. By early 1975, the Glomar Explorer was docked quietly in Long Beach Harbor, its deck stripped of equipment and its hull repainted to erase the marks of its impossible voyage. The mission had ended, but its shadow loomed over Washington like a ghost no one dared name. Inside Langley, the CIA's leadership faced a new kind of crisis, one they couldn't control with secrecy alone. Too many people had been involved, too much money had been spent, and too many whispers were leaking from the walls of Hughes's companies. Contractors who had built sections of the ship knew something unusual had occurred, and reporters from the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times had begun poking around. They asked questions about Project Jennifer, a term that didn't officially exist, but had appeared in procurement paperwork accidentally left unredacted. The CIA's press office was blindsided. To the journalists, the story looked like a corporate boondoggle. Howard Hughes building $1 billion ship that vanished for months and returned with nothing. To the agency, it was a potential disaster. If the public learned that the United States had violated international waters to recover a Soviet nuclear submarine, the political consequences could ignite an international firestorm. Even allies might condemn it as a provocation. At Langley, Director William Colby convened a closed meeting with senior staff. The conclusion was unanimous. The truth could never be admitted. And so, the CIA crafted a new kind of response, one that neither confirmed nor denied anything. When a journalist named Harriet Ann Philippi from the Los Angeles Times filed a Freedom of Information Act request asking for documentation about the Glomar Explorer, the CIA's legal office produced a phrase that would become immortal in government secrecy. The agency can neither confirm nor deny the existence of records responsive to your request. It was clean, emotionless, and impossible to argue against. The journalists were stunned. They had never encountered such a statement before. But within the intelligence community, it was hailed as genius. It gave nothing away, admitted nothing, and could be applied to any classified operation. This linguistic shield, the Glomar response, would soon spread to every branch of government, becoming a permanent fixture of bureaucratic denial. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence was running its own investigation. At the Kremlin, Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, commander of the Soviet Navy, was furious. He had lost one of his prized ballistic missile submarines, and now his analysts suspected that the Americans had not only found it, but stolen parts of it. KGB Director Yuri Andropov authorized new surveillance missions under Operation Trawl, deploying research ships disguised as trawlers to monitor American naval activity across the Pacific. In August 1975, one of those ships, the Chajma, intercepted communication chatter suggesting unusual U.S. Navy operations near Hawaii. The Kremlin became convinced that the Americans had indeed carried out a recovery. For months, diplomatic tension quietly grew beneath the surface. In Washington, a National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger, was briefed but maintained plausible deniability, later remarking, "If they ask, we didn't do it. If they don't ask, we definitely won't do it." Yet secrecy was a fragile thing, especially when mixed with pride. Some engineers involved in the project couldn't resist dropping hints in bars or to friends, describing the deepest salvage ever attempted. By February 1975, investigative reporter Jack Anderson received a tip from a defense contractor about a CIA salvage ship that grabbed a Soviet submarine. He brought the story to CBS News. Panic erupted inside the CIA. The director called the White House directly. Within hours, Kissinger himself contacted CBS President Richard Salant, warning him that airing the story could endanger national security and damage the U.S.-Soviet relations at a critical time. CBS agreed to temporarily hold the report, but secrecy never holds forever. In March 1975, the Los Angeles Times broke the story. The headline was simple but explosive. CIA salvage ship brought up part of Soviet sub lost in Pacific, sources say. The leaks spread like wildfire. Newspapers across the world printed variations of the story, calling it the billion-dollar spy mission and Hughes' secret submarine caper. The CIA scrambled to contain the damage. When asked for comment, spokesman Angus Thurmer delivered the now famous line, "We can neither confirm nor deny." The phrase instantly became front-page material, quoted with fascination and mockery. Soviet diplomats in Washington demanded explanations, but the State Department deflected, insisting that Hughes' ship was a private venture. Privately, Soviet officials knew better. Intelligence intercepts confirmed that their communications codes had changed soon after K-129's disappearance, a clear sign the Americans had learned something valuable. And yet Moscow chose restraint. The Brezhnev government, facing economic stagnation and preparing for the Helsinki Accords, couldn't afford to escalate tensions over an incident they couldn't prove. In their internal records, they simply noted, the Americans recovered part of K-129. No retaliation recommended. For the CIA, that silence was victory enough. Publicly, the agency weathered the media storm with its Glomar phrase. Privately, it dismantled evidence. The recovered wreckage from K-129 was analyzed, photographed, and then quietly destroyed under classified disposal orders. Even the Glomar Explorer itself was mothballed. It would later be leased to commercial interests, its real purpose buried beneath paperwork and denial. But within the agency, Azorian became a legend, a secret so deep that even those who had worked on it couldn't confirm it existed. The Glomar response had worked. The press moved on, the Soviets stayed quiet, and the operation faded into rumor. Yet beneath the triumph, something had shifted permanently. The Cold War had entered a new phase, not of weapons or territory, but of information. The age of plausible deniability had begun. Secrets were no longer hidden behind silence, but protected by language itself, by words crafted to erase meaning. The operation that had reached the deepest part of the Pacific had also plunged the world into a deeper ocean, one of controlled truth. For nearly 2 decades, Operation Azorian remained buried in classified archives, whispered only in the hallways of Langley and among retired naval engineers who dared not speak its name aloud. Officially, the United States had never attempted to retrieve a Soviet submarine. Unofficially, every senior intelligence officer in Washington understood that the Glomar Explorer's success had rewritten the limits of espionage. It was the Cold War's perfect secret, a triumph no one could brag about, a scandal no one could investigate. Yet history has a way of forcing the truth to the surface, just as the CIA had once forced a submarine up from the deep. The first cracks in the wall of secrecy appeared in the late 1980s, when a new generation of journalists began filing Freedom of Information Act requests about Project Jennifer. They knew the Glomar response had been invented for that case, and they suspected the story behind it must have been extraordinary. Each request was met with the same sterile phrase, neither confirm nor deny, but the persistence of those words only drew more curiosity. The Cold War was winding down, and the press had grown bolder. Meanwhile, former crewmen, now in their 60s, began sharing fragments of their memories. They didn't reveal classified details, but their stories hinted at a massive ocean recovery far beyond known technology. In 1992, a declassified Department of Defense budget document accidentally revealed a line item referring to a special project vessel recovery operation, 1974, confirming what had long been suspected. The Pentagon scrambled to redact the document, but it was too late. The media seized on it, reigniting global interest. At the same time, inside Russia, the Soviet archives were opening after the collapse of the USSR. Declassified naval records confirmed that K-129 had gone missing in 1968 and that Moscow had conducted massive search operations under the codename Project Caesar. The revelation sent historians and journalists racing to connect the dots. In 1993, the CIA quietly acknowledged to the families of the Soviet sailors that American forces had recovered their remains and buried them at sea with full military honors. A videotape of the ceremony, long sealed in vaults, was given to the Russian government. When the footage aired on Russian television, viewers were stunned. The grainy film showed American officers standing solemnly over caskets draped with the Soviet flag, lowering them into the Pacific while a bugler played a mournful tune. For many Russians, it was the first time they saw their Cold War adversaries as human, not monsters. The gesture softened decades of bitterness, but it also exposed the depth of the deception. For 20 years, both nations had kept silent about a story that symbolized the madness and ingenuity of their rivalry. The operation had been about more than intelligence. It had been about dominance, the proof that one side could reach anywhere, even into the graveyard of the sea. After the film's release, American journalists renewed their push for declassification. Under pressure from historians, Congress, and the public, the CIA reluctantly agreed to release partial information in 2010. What emerged confirmed much of what had been rumored. The mission's name was indeed Azorian, not Project Jennifer, which had been a cover term used in budget paperwork. The documents described how the CIA had partnered with Howard Hughes to create a cover story, how Clementine had been built, and how the mission had recovered part of the submarine. Most details about the recovered intelligence remained redacted, but enough was revealed to establish Azorian as one of the boldest operations of the Cold War. The CIA's own history office called it a triumph of engineering and secrecy unmatched in the 20th century. But the declassified pages also revealed the cost, more than $800 million, equivalent to over $4 billion today. It was the most expensive intelligence operation in history. The revelations reignited debate in Congress over the boundaries of covert action. If the CIA could build an entire fake industry, spend billions in secret, and deceive allies and adversaries alike, what limits truly existed? Some senators called it a necessary evil. Others called it the very definition of unaccountable power. The agency, true to its tradition, remained silent. When journalists asked about Azorian, the response remained the same. We can neither confirm nor deny. The phrase, once born out of desperation, had become doctrine. It now appeared in official responses about drone programs, surveillance, and counterterrorism. The Glomar response had outlived the Glomar Explorer itself. The ship, after years of sitting idle, had been converted for deep-sea drilling and eventually scrapped in 2015. Its wrecked hull, stripped of its legendary secrecy, was sold for parts in China. But its legacy endures. In every classified denial, every blacked-out page, every whispered acknowledgement that sometimes the most powerful truth is the one left unsaid. Operation Azorian stands as the Cold War's most audacious secret, a blend of genius, deception, and quiet tragedy. The men who built the Glomar Explorer achieved what no one else dared attempt, yet they could never tell their families what they had done. The engineers who risked their lives recovering the wreck were written out of history for decades. Even now, many of their names remain unknown. The operation's success proved a dangerous idea that in the Cold War, truth itself could be engineered, hidden, and weaponized. When the CIA raised the K-129 from the depths of the Pacific, it didn't just lift steel, it lifted the boundary between what could be known and what could be denied. That invisible line would define geopolitics for the rest of the century. Decades after the Glomar Explorer's silent voyage, the ripples of Operation Azorian still pulse through the corridors of power, shaping the way nations wage shadow wars. What began as a desperate gamble to steal Soviet secrets from the ocean floor became a masterclass in psychological warfare, engineering audacity, and the art of erasing the truth. By the 21st century, Azorian was more than an operation. It was a myth embedded in the DNA of modern espionage. Inside the CIA's Museum of Classified History, a single plaque acknowledges the mission in cryptic terms, an achievement of extraordinary depth and precision. No names, no photographs, no credit. Yet intelligence officers visiting the exhibit understand exactly what it means. To them, Azorian represents the moment America proved it could reach into any realm, land, sky, or sea, and rewrite the rules of secrecy itself. The operation's influence didn't end with the Cold War. Its tactics, corporate front operations, layered cover stories, and technological innovation disguised as civilian research became the blueprint for future covert missions. When the U.S. launched surveillance satellites disguised as weather probes, when it built cyber weapons hidden inside ordinary software updates, when it ran private shell companies to move funds for foreign operations, all of it echoed Azorian's logic. Hide the extraordinary behind the ordinary. Engineers who had worked on the Glomar Explorer later joined classified programs at DARPA and the Navy's Special Projects Office, carrying their lessons into the age of stealth and space reconnaissance. The ocean recovery technology itself paved the way for deep-sea exploration vehicles and modern submarine rescue systems. Even NASA's subsea analogs for extraterrestrial missions trace their lineage back to Clementine's hydraulics. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was cultural. Before Azorian, secrecy meant silence. After Azorian, secrecy meant control. The Glomar response, we can neither confirm nor deny, became a weapon as effective as any missile, a way to bend perception and shape reality. Governments around the world adopted it. In Moscow, Beijing, London, and Washington, officials learned that ambiguity was stronger than lies. The Soviets, ironically, copied the very method the CIA had used against them. By the late 1970s, the KGB was issuing identical denials when confronted with reports about their own ocean espionage programs. The Cold War had become a theater not just of weapons but of words. Carefully engineered truths designed to outlast scrutiny. For the men who had been there, though, the legacy was more personal. Captain Jim Bradley retired quietly in California, refusing interviews until his death in 2002. His family later found a small box among his belongings containing a single keepsake, a rusted Soviet insignia from K-129 mounted on wood. A note beneath it read simply, "We raised the impossible." Other crew members carried lifelong guilt about the sailors they had disturbed, men who had died serving their own country, unaware their final resting place would one day be invaded by their enemies. Yet most spoke of pride, a sense that they had taken part in something beyond measure, something history itself could barely contain. In Russia, the story of K-129 remains sacred. Every year, veterans of the Soviet Pacific Fleet gather in Vladivostok to honor the lost submarine. For decades, they cursed the Americans for desecrating their dead. But when the burial footage surfaced in the 1990s, the tone changed. They gave our comrades respect, one admiral admitted, more than our own government gave us at times. The gesture had bridged a gulf that weapons never could. In a strange human way, Operation Azorian had united two enemies in grief. Strategically, the operation marked the high tide of Cold War competition. It revealed that victory wasn't only measured by armies or nuclear stockpiles, but by who could innovate faster, deceive better, and reach further. America's ability to construct an entire false industry, fool its own public, and manipulate global perception showed that information, not firepower, was the new currency of power. The Soviets learned from it. Within years, Moscow had doubled down on disinformation campaigns, propaganda operations, and technological countermeasures. The arms race had evolved into an intelligence race. Decades later, when digital warfare replaced espionage at sea, the lessons of Azorian still guided strategy. Cyber attacks, satellite interceptions, and covert drone programs all owed their philosophical roots to that single mission. Proof that no frontier was off limits if one had the will to reach it. Yet for all its triumph, Azorian also left behind an unspoken warning. When secrecy becomes limitless, so does the danger of its abuse. The Glomar response that once protected a mission of national survival would, in later decades, shield darker acts, torture programs, illegal surveillance, and covert wars without oversight. The very mechanism that preserved truth from the enemy, now preserved lies from accountability. In that sense, Operation Azorian didn't just raise a submarine, it raised a paradox. It showed the world how far power could go when cloaked in silence. Today, when governments deny, redact, or deflect, when truth drowns in classification, the ghost of the Glomar Explorer still haunts the ocean of bureaucracy. Its engines may have rusted, its mission long over, but its echo remains, a reminder that the deepest waters of the Cold War were never in the Pacific, but in the human obsession with secrecy. And somewhere 3 miles below the surface, the broken body of K-129 still lies in the dark, watched by no one, untouched for half a century. It rests as both a tomb and a monument to the men who died serving their country, to the engineers who defied the abyss, and to the invisible war that changed the meaning of truth itself. The Cold War produced many stories of danger, heroism, and deception, but none as strange and haunting as the day the CIA reached into the deepest part of the earth, not to fight, not to destroy, but to uncover a secret so powerful it could never truly be told.